Call to order the City Finance Committee meeting for June 7th. Ms. Bjork or Mr. Dayton, who's going to start? Mr. Toth? Mr. Dayton. Actually, is there anybody who'd like to speak on anything that's not on the agenda? Seeing no one, we'll continue with the item on the agenda, which is strategies to increase capital funding to streets and related infrastructure.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. We've been doing a series of meetings talking about the street fund and the condition of the roads, and then also a broader discussion on infrastructure, city infrastructure. And just to give you an idea of the meetings we've done to date, there's been 5 meetings we've had, and we've gone through this path and looking, kind of having this ongoing discussion about what to do about the street funds, and then getting into the broader discussion of the larger infrastructure, and seemingly to be honing in on a couple different strategies. One would be a new revenue source, and then also about making adjustments to the way we do things to create cost efficiencies, and then also doing some cost shifts. So today what we want to focus on is 2 things. We want to start talking about what are the potential cost shifts that we would do, and that would be done in a mid-cycle budget for FY17. And then we also want to start narrowing the various options for new revenue sources. We've talked about the new sales tax, but we've also got a number of options that we want to just make sure that you've considered them, and there may even be more that we're not thinking of that you want to bring up. So kind of 2 parts to that meeting. What that will do is that'll take us into a meeting in June 28th, where we'll talk more about the new revenue sources, and then we'll come back to you on July 19th for something that's really kind of packaged together for a recommendation to council. To start off the presentation, just talking, here's the overview. What we want to do is we want to first talk about the cost savings and efficiencies that we've already completed. So there's some good news on the table. Then look at those potential cost shifts. We want to pause the discussion at that point and look at the list that we've generated in cost shifts and just talk about it a bit before we move on to the new thought, which are those potential new revenue options. So getting into the cost savings and efficiencies, we have operational changes that we're putting forward in streets. And one of the things that we talked to you about early on is that the streets crew, they used to actually do a lot of pavement maintenance. And we've kind of gotten away from those activities in the past as our equipment's gotten older and we haven't replaced it. So the thought and the strategic thought about doing more with what we have is to actually buy some equipment, some smaller equipment. This is in some recommendations from the LAC report. And those are actually the 2 pieces of equipment up on the screen that we're looking to purchase. The top one is a milling. It grinds the street down, and the second one is an overlay machine. And so we would actually put our street crews to work to repaving streets. And so that's the redirecting to increase those activities, which is on the right, the street paving and sidewalk repair and replacement, storm drain maintenance, and then reducing some of the other activities, the graffiti removal, right-of-way trash pickup, illegal encampment cleanup. And how do we reduce those activities? It's not like we just stop them. We've talked about this a little bit. On the trash pickup, we're working with Marburg under the existing contract to try to pick up as much trash in the right-of-way that we're seeing as we can. And that will relieve one full-time equivalent from our streets crew to be committed to other street-related activities. We would still need to work with Marburg in a future contract on nailing that down completely. Then in illegal encampment, we talked to you about moving that from streets to Big Green and having the police department have that responsibility, just calling Big Green and having that contracted. So that seems to be working well. And then portable restrooms. We used to have 2 portable restrooms on Yananali next to the labor line. We've reduced that to 1 for a savings of $9,000. The graffiti removal, still working on how that would be contracted out. We have some salary savings that we're looking at. In the first one is proposed for FY17. One of the project engineers would be shifted to a general fund position, so that would be Measure A, funded currently, would move to a general fund if the council approves that budget. And then we also have some vacancies that are being placed on hold in transportation section or division. So, and that there's a planner, half of a planner, and then 2 street workers. So we will continue to look on, as we have the vacancies on hold, we will wait for the outcomes of the LAC report to determine what are the future staffing levels that are really appropriate before we start refilling the positions. So it's kind of a 2-pronged strategy. We capture some savings now, and then also, depending upon what the outcomes of that, we can make adjustments. So this is a summary of the cost savings and efficiencies that we have done to date. So it's actually a pretty sizable number. It's not change. It's something that could get some streets repaved with, and we could do some actual work with. So moving on to cost shifts. So,
Mr. Chair, do we ask questions on things now, or are we waiting to the end to?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So back to the paving machine. In the earlier mention of that, it was proposed to lease those machines. And then what you just said was to buy those machines. So that's one question. And the other one is, do we have any sense of the comparison of cost of this proposal as opposed to what we've experienced in terms of contracting?
Well,
when those questions are appropriate, if there's a better time than this, then okay.
this is fine. Okay. So, Mr. Chair and Councilmember White, we have moved forward at this time to purchase that grinding machine, and you can call it a lease purchase. The way the lease arrangement's set up, we can lease it now, and we have until the calendar year then to pay for it. But over and above that, our city purchasing requirements are such that we need to encumber the entire amount of funds now, even if we lease it. So we're moving forward at this time to purchase it, recognizing that to lease it for 6 months and then buy it is sort of more work than it is just to purchase it. And that grinder, but that Bobcat grinder arrangement you see in the top picture, that is approximately $150,000 or so. So that's sort of the cost of that. Now on the paver, which is the lower right-hand picture, that cost is approximately $180,000 or so. And so we're deferring our final decisions and timing on purchasing that equipment until later this calendar year for 2 reasons. A, it's a cost, and then B, we're training on that top equipment, the grinder, and we're coordinating with engineering division on their capital projects they're putting together so that we can do sort of the prep work with them. That is, we're going to use that grinder to do spot repairs, and the pilot project for the spot repairs is residential east side streets. And so starting in early July, you'll see our staff out there doing those spot repairs on small residential streets. And we're going to get up to speed and see how proficient we can get at that and how many staff we need long-term to do that. We think it's on the order of 6 staff, but might be a little more, and as we get proficient, might be a little less. But we won't really be prepared to do work on paving until after we've mastered that first set of work. And what we don't want to do is purchase a paver and have it sitting in a yard for a few months, and then everyone says, well, look, you bought that paver, and now you're not even using it. So we feel confident we'll be doing good work with the paving machine, but we want to sort of incrementally get ourselves into the paving business. And so delaying the purchase of that paver until next fiscal year is a good idea, we think.
Thank you for that. And then the other area is, as this project is being resumed, as I'm understanding, this was something that was done, but it would probably be good to have that history of, and what is the cost compared to, there must have been other ways that this was done. It was part of the contracting services at another time. As this is being ramped up, it would be a good idea to be able to have a comparison of costs on this effort versus the contracting one.
Yes, and so Mr. Demore is in the audience, so I kind of defer to Brian on what the capital costs are. You've heard before the talk about how much does it cost us to pave a block, like a residential block, and through the capital program, it's somewhere on the order of $75,000 to $80,000 per block. We're developing preliminary costs of what we think city staff will cost. And what we're finding is that even if city staff does the work, there are some tasks associated with repaving that we would contract out. That is, if we're going to do large block paving, not just spot repair, that grinder that we purchased is too small. It's great for spot repairs, but it's not good enough for full street-wide grinding. It would take us a long time to grind a block with that machine. So we would probably subcontract out the grinding, and we would subcontract out the tacking of the street after we grind and remove, and we would contract out the street sweeping because we don't have a street sweeper. And all that said, if we had a paving machine doing it with our staff, we believe we could pave a block for under $55,000. That's a ballpark cost. But we're thinking we could be competitive if we can beat that $80,000 block estimate by 25-30%. And that's our goal. And we will, after we prepare a preliminary estimate, we'll be sharing it with Engineering Division and their consultant, and all agree on what we think the cost is. And if we truly are competitive, then we'll move forward in FY17, early FY17, to purchase the paver. But we're not going to purchase the paver only to find out that it costs us more than contracting out.
So without the paver, then how are you, and you do the grinding, what are you going to do to finish the road? You're going to contract out for the paving?
Yes, we're coordinating with Engineering Division. So basically, when we get through with the spot repairs, you'll find that, the street surface looks kind of like a quilt. Might not be pretty, in a way it's similar to other type of prep work. But then we would coordinate with Engineering Division, so as they have the funds to contract the work out for final paving, then they would take that up. Normally, as a part of their contracts, they have the contractor do the spot repair first. It's just we're doing it first, hopefully at a savings. We believe it'll be a savings as opposed to what a contractor would cost. But then there may be some time delay before contract work comes out to finish the street.
But how do you even do the spot repair without the paving machine? Do you just do that by hand?
Well, we would do it by hand, and we have a smaller roller that we'd be able to roller compact. And we could do
finding little depressions in the road, things like that, the cracks that are getting into the base, but the overall road is not compromised to being completely needing to be repaired. And these are, and how did the east side streets become the candidates for the pilot projects?
Largely from logistics, just because they're very proximate to our yard here at Garden Street.
So in terms of time to get out in the field and do the work, it's the most efficient that you could have.
That's right. And so some things we'd have to put on trailers, but the Bobcat, for example, we could probably just drive down the street.
Okay. And where is the east side streets in the normal cycle of maintenance? We have the 6 districts, or not, districts is not the right word, but zones. Are there 6 or 7?
I understand there are 6.
Okay. And we're in which zone?
Pardon me?
East side was 2014, I believe.
Okay.
And we're doing largely residential streets that aren't getting much more than crack seal.
Okay.
Historically, so these streets, many of them haven't been paved in a long time.
Okay.
These are streets, these aren't the collectors or the arterial streets. These are the small residential streets that just haven't had much attention.
So in the zone system, you're not touching residential streets, you're just doing collectors? It's gotten to that level of triage?
I would defer to Mr. Demore, but that's my understanding. I think there's onesie twosies where, for whatever reason, a residential street gets paved. But as a general rule, it's the larger streets that are getting the contract work. It's not the small residential streets.
Brian Demore, city engineer. I'm on.
Is it on? Okay.
So yeah, I think Chris answered that question fairly accurately. For the most part, we have with our $2 million budget or whatever it's been of late, limited funds. There's more need in each zone than the amount of money that we have, so we have to come up with a way of prioritizing, and the roads that get the most use rise to the top. If the PCIs are equal, obviously that makes sense, but even when the PCI on a major arterial, it could be higher than a PCI on a residential, but it's at greater risk of degrading more quickly because of the amount of loading that is on it. So those streets have been getting a lot more of the attention. That's why you'll see like Las Positas has been overlaid, large sections of that recently, State Street as well. Those are the roads that are getting the attention with the capital money. But yeah, hopefully moving forward, having our streets crews more available, they can touch on some of these residential streets where maybe all they need are some repairs in different areas, if it's a wheel path or just point repairs. That's what we're hoping to do to hold those roads together. They may not get a full repave because we're trying to make the most use of the limited funds that we have. I don't know that we're going to get to a point where we're able to repave every street in the city on a 20-year basis. That's the ideal, but I'm trying to make the best use. So I think in the last year there was some slurry seal done on some residential streets. And if you're driving by, it may look like we've repaved that street, but really it's just a thin coat on top of it. And that's typically done after an overlay, 5 to 10 years out. Just gives it a fresh coat and preserves the life. It's a good practice to do that, and we still try to, although this current year we will not have a slurry seal contract, so we don't have that option. It just wasn't going to be a big enough size to attract the slurry seal contractors, and actually, as it turns out, the project was small enough that we had a hard enough time attracting any interest in the overlay contract.
So you weren't able to get a contractor, or you only had one bidder?
We'll be going to council shortly with an agenda item. We got one bid for the project, Zone 3, and the one bid came in over the engineer's estimate.
And Zone 3 is where?
Primarily in the west side.
Okay. And so it's primarily arterials in the west side. It's a significant subset of the whole zone. What percentage of the whole zone is getting work of any kind? Is it 20% or is it 50%?
I don't know. I would guess it's probably more in the matter of 3 to 5%.
3 to 5%.
In that range. So it's very limited.
Okay.
But it might be that it's up to 20 or 25% of the arterials are collectors, and then 0% of residentials.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Moore.
Sure.
Any other questions? Okay, keep going.
So getting into cost shifts, and
Okay. Councilmember Dominguez?
The right-of-way, the illegal encampment, 1 FTE of 92,000. So did that shift to another fund source or another department? Or did we just stop doing the encampment cleanup?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Dominguez, no, it's still in our streets fund budget, but having a contractor do the work, we're targeting or estimating $20,000 a year for homeless encampment removal, and thus far this fiscal year, they've been under 20,000. So we'll be starting again in July. We're hoping it's going to stay in that $20,000 range, but if it goes up a little bit, fine. We'll work to adjust that. But you can see from just the number there that we're saving quite a bit by not paying our street staff to get involved with the process. And we did check in with county swap workers. A couple things are going dynamically with that. The Sheriff's Department is working to change basically the penal requirements so that more people are not really in the SWAP program at all. You know, they're just getting released instead of being imprisoned. And so there's just a smaller source to begin with. And we do pay costs, or we do have liabilities associated with SWAP workers in that if they get injured while they're working for us, then we pay basically their workers' comp costs. And so we think it's a good move to get away from the SWAP program and for financial reasons. And so we think that this will be cost effective to use a contractor for this effort in the coming fiscal year.
And the 92,000 number, is that a net or a gross of the 20,000 that we're paying the contract?
That is, I guess, a gross. That is, we didn't deduct the 20,000 from the 92.
Okay.
That's basically the salary and fringe of a worker that was doing that work.
And the right-of-way trash pickup, does that fall into the same? Or no, that was you shifted that position over to the general fund?
No, we shifted it over to the existing Marburg contract. And so we've got some issues to work out with that. It's not going as smoothly as we had planned. There are some limitations to the existing Marburg contract. We're working on that, and we're coordinating with finance on that, who oversees the Marburg contract. And I know that the Marburg contract is to be renegotiated at some point in the near future within the next year, and so we're hopeful that that scope of work would be increased to deal with that. So that might result in an increase in the Marburg contract, which would be less than that. Mr. Samario is here to further explain the details of the Marburg contract.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, it is on. I know it's not as loud. Finance Director Bob Samario. So we have an existing contract with Marburg, and when we negotiated that a few years ago, we increased, I think we actually doubled the amount of illegal dumping and trash to pick up on the public right-of-way from 1,000 to 2,000 pickups a year. So this shift to where we're eliminating not a streets fund, where they're going to be solely responsible for this function, we think it's a good idea, but we're going to have to work with them to make sure that, you know, it is an amendment to the contract. So we want to make sure that they're compensated for any incremental costs. We don't know what that number is, but they've been very cooperative in general. They've exceeded that 2,000 pickup number already this year. So, you know, and they haven't really come back and asked for that. So we just want to make sure we are sensitive to the fact that this is a change in what we've asked them to do in the agreement, and that they feel that they're being appropriately compensated for that. But we don't see a big problem with this transition.
Well, just to be clear, this is a reduction in service, though, because currently city employees go on a demand responsive basis and go pick up trash that's on the street. And now we're asking Marburg to do it, and they're plugging it into their system, and it's taken a couple of days.
But to be honest, I think Marburg has been doing the lion's share of that work. The city staff has been doing some of that, but Marburg has been doing most of that work. So this is just expanding what they're already doing, and then taking that responsibility more officially away from the streets crews and just shifting it all to the Marburg. But they're doing a lot of it now, so it's a smaller incremental increase from what they're doing today to absorb the additional work.
But isn't it true that it takes longer for things to be picked up in this new model than it did previously?
Yeah, we're not sure. We're working with Marburg to see how quick they can actually pick it up. And it may be a day or two, but we're trying to work with them as part of this to see if they can get a quicker response, so it's not sitting on the streets, you know, for 4 or 5 days. So that part, in terms of level of service, the turnaround, it might be better the way it's handled now. But again, it's for a smaller portion of that pie that city street crews are working on. Marburg has been doing this for many tons of material for the last several years. The streets crews have been doing a very small portion of that. So I don't think people are going to notice much of a difference, but we're still going to try to make sure that the incremental piece that Marburg picks up, that is going to be done on a more timely basis if possible.
Well, I know this has certainly been a topic where residents are concerned and looking for additional service, not reduction. Right. But in the context of what we're struggling with, you know, I understand the tension between those two. But I just wanted to highlight that this change involves a different approach that may or may not be better than what's going on now. and needs to be refined as time goes on to be.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay.
Again, the large magnitude of Marburg is already handling, so there's not going to be any change to that. So we're talking about a smaller piece that they're now going to absorb.
Okay.
So,
Any other questions for Mr. Samaro?
No, and it makes sense to, I think we do need to change the way it's set up now because it is not working, at least on the east side and west side where things are sitting out there for weeks at a time. And we don't know how long it's taking in some situations because someone may not be reporting it. So a couch may be out there for a week before someone calls it into the city. So it's hard to track it. So I think we need to really rely on a process that's robust and best practices,
right.
and then make it work. So thank you for that.
Sure.
Well, this is just, I think we're getting to where it really matters, I think, what we say. So just to be precise on that, what you're suggesting, Councilmember Dominguez, I think is more than what's being contemplated. I think it's all still going to be driven by calls for service. A constituent sees something, they call the city and or Marburg, and when the city calls will get sent to Marburg, and then Marburg will schedule a pickup and go do it. So if somebody waits a week to complain, nothing's going to happen. It's going to be on the curb. I don't think anybody's contemplating a roving band of trucks that would just pick up stuff on their own. So if you were thinking in those terms, I think we need to be clear about what we're talking about here. Councilmember White?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, and to back up to what we've experienced so far this morning, today, is first we heard about the spot repair idea using staff, which is now allocated to another use, which street maintenance, I think was the term used. And so and I'm assuming that that work was either not done at all or it was contracted out. And now we're going to in-house with either work that wasn't being done, and now we're going to start doing it in-house. Am I correct on that? Or we were contracting it out in the past. So now the question there, which I asked earlier, was we want to look at those costs and make sure that we're not, as we've experienced with other things, found that our own in-house work is actually more expensive than the private sector. And then what we're talking about here is contracting out a service which is now being handled by staff and in-house, so one FTE, and that's now in a year time kind of thing, negotiating with Marburg, coming up with a program where Marburg is handling that one FTE work, and those costs are being reduced by $72,000. Is that right? No. Anyway, some amount from where it is now.
Okay. Any other questions? Comments? Okay. Keep going.
So cost shifts is a discussion about what to do in the interim. When we talk about new revenues, the new revenues and getting those can take a lot of time, perhaps 1 to 3 years, getting those new revenues set up, the instruments for doing those things, going to people for votes and things. The cost shifts are about what could we do within the next year's budget to make a difference. And they're not, this is a creative thought process. None of them are easy or it's moving money from the things that the Streets Fund are paying now to other funds and resources. So that's what that list looks like. So we're just going to go through them and just let you know what the thoughts are. There may be more. So in terms of general fund, potential general fund transfers, the thoughts are the list that you have up there that are now street funded activities. So the graffiti removal, which is estimated to be about $197,000. The land development review, I think we've mentioned in the past, the 3 FTEs at $430,000 were shifted from the general fund to the street funds to help the general fund when it needed help. So that's a potential target. The illegal encampment cleanup, which is the remaining portion that Mr. Toth mentioned at $20,000. And then Measure A engineering, there's 4 FTEs remaining that are still funded by Measure A. And so the thought there is that those would be transferred to the general fund, and then they would start billing. The difference of how much that would hit the general fund would vary over time, depending upon how much the billing returns to the general fund. In some years it does, and some years it doesn't. So those are the transfers from the general fund. This is a potential efficiency in terms of who does the work. Right now, storm drain maintenance, the little that we do is done by streets. Wastewater section has the proper equipment, the Vector trucks that could do that better. So the thought there is to get the equipment efficiency that they already have, not to have wastewater section pay for that service, but to just simply transfer the funding to someone who could probably do it better. And then the efficiency saving is actually the maintenance cost on a new Vector. That $45,000 is the maintenance cost on a new Vector truck. So small savings, but it all adds up. The next one is about Measure B, and just to be really super careful about talking about Measure B, is the ordinance allows for, you can see it's written up there and what it does. So it focuses on improvement of water quality. The council has made policy direction to staff in terms of focusing on new and expanded programs, not servicing that which we're already doing. So in recommending the policy, the shifts that we're talking about here, that would require a council rediscussion of those policies because they are existing services. But here's the list that you have up there, and storm drain maintenance, the commercial sweeping that's down, the remaining portable restroom on Yananali, and then the quality, the NPDES permitting that we do every year. The transfer of the sidewalk maintenance, you could actually maybe even put this in the new revenues category, or you could put it in cost shifts. It could fit in either one. But it's essentially, it's the thought we brought to you in a previous committee meeting that other cities are doing, where they're transferring the cost of sidewalk repair and liability over to the property owners that have the sidewalks in front of their property. And there's many ways and variations to do that cities have put forth, and we explained the Los Angeles model. But that our program is about $900,000 that we spend right now, and that we could either cover that cost or we could increase the program's ability to repair and replace. The downtown waterfront shuttle is currently shared cost between water.
Sure, I want to.
Councilmember White?
Because that's you mentioned the Los Angeles model as one, and which are we going to have? Is this the extent of that conversation?
No, if you, for instance, if the committee said, hey, we really want you to look further at that, and we want you to, then the next meetings that we're teeing up for,
I see.
We would bring what we think, based on other cities' models, might work best for Santa Barbara.
Okay.
So we're looking to see that nod that this is something you want us to bring back.
All right. So we'll have another opportunity to at least discuss that.
That's
Okay.
correct.
Thank you.
And how did you come up with the $900,000 cost estimate of that? Seems
That I believe is our current budget level. That if you look at our budget within the street section, this includes FTEs as well as non-personnel costs, but that's roughly our budget.
So this is what we spend. It has nothing in relationship to the need.
This is what we budget and not necessarily spend. We do spend monies out of capital as well. That is, we've got about $250,000 a year in our capital budget to do sidewalk-related contracts. So between this and capital, there is a sizable amount for sidewalk repair and maintenance, yet we have very large needs that go beyond that budget level.
Councilmember Dominguez?
So I have down for sidewalk repairs $250,000 for fiscal year 16.
That's in the capital budget. But we also have in our operating budget this level of budgeting that includes FTEs, and I think it's a large number of FTEs, something on the order of 8. And I'll have to check the budget to see if it's a little more, a little less, but that's largely it. And so an associated amount of NPE or non-personnel expenses that go along with those FTEs. Our average personnel cost, loaded personnel costs for maintenance workers on this is something on the order of $100,000 or more a year. So you take 8 times that, and we're pretty much right up to that 900,000, which doesn't leave a lot for supplies and materials.
How much sidewalk are we fixing every year?
That's a good question. Briefly, what I understand is, overall we've got about 7 million square feet of sidewalk, and our goal is to replace 20,000 square feet a year. You can see us up near State Street in Anapamu now. We're doing some work up there with sidewalks. But we use 2 years of capital money, $250,000 a year times 2, and we just let out a contract earlier this year that largely went to the West Side neighborhoods, where we spent about $400,000 or so repairing and replacing sidewalks on West Side residential streets. I don't have the square footage of that contract right before me, but we're whittling away at it. It's just that, we're trying to repair and replace streets. It's just that, sidewalks, but it's just that we're not going to be able to do this long term to keep up with the pace of deterioration.
And Mr. Chair.
Councilmember White?
Yeah, I think of whittling away as making progress, and we're not. At least my understanding is we're not, and I would hope that as we're having the conversation, we're calling a spade. And
that's correct.
We have something like 350 miles of sidewalk. Is that the ballpark?
Well, we have roughly a little over 250 miles of street.
Right.
So you multiply that by 2, but yet a lot of our streets don't have sidewalks
Exactly.
for a number of reasons. And I think that's a good assessment right now.
Right.
We
Again,
are working.
I hope that we're talking the same language of, no, we're not whittling away at it. It's whittling on us.
You're absolutely right. By saying whittling away, I didn't mean to say that we were making
Fighting the good fight.
substantive
but
progress
it's more
on
like
this.
the Alamo rather than.
We're treading water.
Thank you.
So what would be the cost to maintain the sidewalks at the current level?
I would have to get back with you on that number. I would say you could double it or triple it easily.
Okay. Do we do a grading system like we do on the streets?
We have had a consultant do that in the past, where they basically took the sidewalk defects and labeled them, categorized them as A, B, and C. That study is approximately 12 or more years old. Sidewalks have changed since then. We're coordinating internally with our IS staff to improve our GIS so that we have a sidewalk layer, so we have a container which to plug in all these data points of the work that's done. We don't have that now. We're relying on spreadsheets and pieces of paper, and it's difficult for us to get a comprehensive picture over what we've done the last number of years with sidewalks.
But I am recalling, Mr. Chair, that there is a number that was plugged into the, when we were doing all the unfunded liability stuff, that there was a sidewalk number in that as well. Obviously, it's going to be ballparky, but that might be helpful for you and us to be reminded of what that number is. Thank you.
Okay. Go ahead, Mr. Truff.
So the final cost shift thought is the downtown waterfront shuttle. This is funded by 3 different sources right now: downtown parking, waterfront, and then Measure A. And so the Measure A portion is about $615,000. So the thought there is that we would break up the cost of the shuttle between the waterfront and the downtown, and we've estimated based on, you can see the service area on the map in blue, that the waterfront area portion, if you look at the service hours on that versus the downtown portion, it's about 75% for the downtown portion and the remaining for the waterfront portion. And so those suggested numbers up there for waterfront and downtown parking are based upon the total cost divided by the 75 and 25%. And the contract expires next year, so it is an appropriate time for us to start looking at what is the service valuation and looking at the funding source. The other issue that we have was the actual replacement of the vehicles, which MTD is coming forward with a proposal pretty soon to tell us what their thoughts are on replacing that fleet. So here's the summary of those cost shift thoughts. You see when you start to add them all up, it begins to look like a pretty strong number. The one that staff is kind of leaning towards in terms of the most straightforward, I guess, way to put that with the service changes we're looking at with the shuttle is to transfer the downtown waterfront shuttle funds into the waterfront and the downtown parking. So, but here's where I'm going to pause on this slide and see if there's any feedback from the committee to see if any of these. I think I heard from Committee Member White about the looking at the sidewalk maintenance to property owners, but looking for your direction.
Okay, comments from the committee? Thoughts? I guess I have a question. So transferring the first four items, a little over $1 million in cost from the streets fund to the general fund is just really an accounting issue. It isn't making, it's just causing $1 million deficit on the general fund side. So it's a decision almost related to changing capital projects and saying we're going to have fewer capital projects in the general fund for other things besides streets. The Measure B issues are different in that, but they have the same implications to Measure B. They come at a cost to Measure B projects, and then the property owner shift is clearly a significant change from sidewalk maintenance to property owners. And the downtown waterfront shuttle, the same, I guess, within the enterprise funds in terms of their impact. So I see we have staff here. I think Scott's here from the waterfront department, and nobody here. Oh, Rob for parking. Okay. All right. Any comments? Comments here, I know, from Measure B. Councilmember White?
I mean, and I appreciate your making the point that there's a bookkeeping move here on the first number of items, and obviously that doesn't make more money. It just so what your conclusion out of that, and that's helpful for us to consider, is so that would basically be taking a chunk out of the capital program. It's got to come out of somewhere.
Mr. Chair, Council Member, I mean, yeah, these are all tough. It's kind of why we're up against it, because these are all important things to do, but none of our funds are in a real healthy position to kind of take on that responsibility. I think our idea of putting the general fund options on there is that perhaps in the past they've been funded by general fund, or they seem more appropriately if you were just starting from scratch to be funded from the general fund. The general fund's not in a great position right now to absorb those costs. And they're really ongoing operational costs. And so it's either finding $1 million in our operational general fund budget. Our starting point is about $1 million of general fund capital. And then from other sources, we're able to kind of build it up to $2 or $3 million. And so it's essentially replacing your general fund capital if you moved it to that fund. So that's difficult.
Absolutely, it's difficult, and please stay right there if you would, Mr. Casey, because where I'm working from is we've no matter what our budget is as we come to July 1st and finalizing a budget, I'm imagining that the team, the full staff team, in terms of presenting something, has to have a hard time proposing to spend as little as was initially allocated to paving, and that how do we do differently, and what's our how do we prioritize triage going forward? And I'm very interested in hearing staff recommendations on this. It's not just, I mean, we got there by the UUT going south on us, and as one element of this 2-year budget. Am I correct? And another one is that our forecasts were off by this in the second year. Would those be a couple of things that
For the general fund or the street fund? Or
for the city system and I mean, was how did we get here? And then going forward, we don't want to get here again. I guess that's part of where I'm headed, is to say, all right, is it forecasts that hurt us in here, so that going forward, as we see things are, and in the way it feels out there, things feel kind of tenuous. So quarterly, as we go along, do we see that our forecast was going to be 3% and we're ending up at 2% growth or whatever? Early on, we're hitting it perhaps a little harder, might help us to then start, for example, this hiring chill, which nobody wants, but one wants it if that's a way to get $2 million, $3 million into the paving fund, or whatever is going to be the minimum number that we feel is tolerable. I'm wandering around in my comments, but I do want a staff recommendation out of these things of how do we, what number are we shooting at as a target for, here's $3 million. Now, is there, on top of this, would there be the $900,000 that is already budgeted? So then we'd end up at 4.2 would be the paving number that we'd be talking about if all of this were to magically happen. And this is actually part of a mid cycle. We're not talking about this hitting this budget cycle, but midway through the 16-17. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, staff is happy to come up with some recommendations. All these are tough choices, and they're tough political choices. And so we can take the first stab at throwing out there, and you all can react to it. At some point, we're going to need you to react to it and give us some direction. The general fund, I don't think we're going to carve more savings out of the general fund to put into the streets program. I think council gave us direction on deferring some capital projects that put some money into streets capital. I think that was a good decision. And so that's good. So that'll bump up the capital a little bit. We're hopeful that something will come out of the governor's budget proposal that the state will do that will give us some capital money that we're not projecting now. So I think we're starting to scrape some things together, and on the operational side, we've scraped together, a decent chunk of money. And so when you put those together, we've got a capital program to kind of band-aid together for another year or so. Doesn't help solve our trend going forward, which is really difficult. The lists that you have up here, they're all fraught with difficulties. Quite frankly, we don't recommend doing the general fund right now, but it's something to keep in mind if the general fund budget becomes a little healthier, to start shifting some of these things out of the streets fund into the general fund. But I don't think the general fund has the capacity to make those adjustments right now for all the reasons that you just said. Measure B is very difficult. It's always been a challenge politically to talk about what Measure B pays for and doesn't, and that's why we had that slide in there that talks about prior council policy and direction. So I think staff's going to be uncomfortable recommending something that goes against prior council policy and direction. Council can recommend a change to council policy and direction, but I don't think it's fair to ask staff to kind of go against what has been past practice in that regard. And quite frankly, we highlight the downtown waterfront shuttle. If we're trying to come up with some money somehow, we think that that is the opportunity for you to shift some funds to other funds that aren't going to be thrilled about taking on those responsibilities. Waterfront didn't budget for $200,000 to help pay for the waterfront downtown shuttle. Downtown parking hasn't been planning on picking up that cost. But there's some logic and nexus to make that move, and we're in a difficult situation here of having to make difficult recommendations and thoughts. And so from a staff standpoint, when we look at potential $3.3 million, that's the one we kind of fall to, that you could do. And it doesn't come without pain or discomfort to the funds that take on that responsibility.
Well, I really appreciate that, Mr. Casey, and it's none of it's easy. And however, I think this is healthy to be looking forward and trying to squeeze some more efficiencies out of it. And as I say, it's just I appreciate that the council needs to make the change of policy, but you're at least highlighting that that's one opportunity to increase funding for paving out of that uncomfortable source.
And we've got a little bit more to present to you today on the revenue side, but maybe is to get a little more reaction, and then at a future meeting we can kind of bring back kind of what staff recommends when you kind of bring all these sources together, how that leads to a capital program, and you all can react to that.
Well, then I'll just chime in on the sidewalk. Thank you, Mr. Casey. The sidewalk maintenance piece. I've been following, and maybe I expect that my colleagues have too, this painful process in Los Angeles, where this is on a mega scale. I mean, they're talking about spending $1 billion or something like that on paving, on fixing sidewalks, and then turning them over. And I think it's primarily in the commercial centers. And I would be hoping to. I see Mr. Casey not being skeptical. I believe it's commercial. Is the?
I think it's everything. Actually.
You think it's everything?
Yes.
Okay. Well, in any case, I think that's one of the unattractive places where I ask that we at least look at as an option. The bad news there is you have to come up with the money, as LA is proposing to come up with the money to do the fixing first before they turn it over. So there obviously has to be a substantial amount of money, and it would be, in our case, it would be, $10, $20 million, shall we say, or some number like that, in order to kickstart these repairs to make some areas acceptable, meeting a standard, and then turning them over to the private sector. I think it's one way to go, which I think has merit to look at.
Any other comments about that? Well, I think it is fraught with complexities and difficulty. I'll be honest with you. I can't imagine how we would be able to go to the voters and say, we would like you to increase the sales tax to generate money for us to fix some amount of sidewalks, probably not all of them, and then also have you assume responsibility from that point going on forward. It may be necessary. In reality, I just don't know how that is a politically saleable concept, to ask people to raise taxes and then take on the obligation to maintain them. It's something that will be fascinating to watch how they do that in Los Angeles. I don't understand how that makes any political sense at all, but good for them for trying and having a conversation about it. And I think it highlights how far off revenues and expenditures are, that communities are even talking about things like that. So I guess I don't really personally see much utility in the transfers to the general fund. I mean, I understand that it makes sense. We could do this in a completely different way. We could say, let's take all of the revenues that come to the city for road maintenance, the UUT dollars, the gas tax dollars, and the Measure A dollars, and have those all go for streets, and then transfer all the costs, to the general fund. And we would solve the problem of paving the roads, and we would have a massive problem on the general fund. So this is just a degree in that continuum, asking us the question of, does this make any sense to do? And I understand these were shifted over to the streets fund from the general fund. It all seems awfully arbitrary, in that respect. So good job of putting it on the table. Don't know that gets us much at all. And I think that the transfers to Measure B have a similar problem in the sense that, that's the most recent compact we have with the voters, where we said, we're going to do something if you raise your taxes. And now, this is potentially changing that compact. And I think it's very dangerous to do that. And I don't think that's not what the voters contemplated. And I think that I'm sure that the Creeks Committee will object, and, we'll have that significant debate, and it will influence the future veracity of the claims that we're going to make about additional revenue in the future and what we would use that money for. So it is a very slippery slope, and it may make sense, from just a technical standpoint. These are things that are related to creek cleanliness, but the fact was, on the ballot measure, we said we were going to do new things with this money, not pay for things that were already going on, and all of these things, I believe, are already going on when Measure B passed. And then the transfer of the downtown waterfront shuttle, I think that is one that is probably worth talking about because the enterprise funds that would be would shoulder that burden are in better financial shape than the city's general fund is, and that's just a fact, and it's just simple reality. I know that Mr. Reedman isn't excited about it, but I think that is worth talking about. Does anyone know if the new contract that MTD would propose, how they would handle the capital replacement of the shuttles? Has that even come up in discussion?
Thank you. That's a great question. Mr. Chair, MTD board, the director has been discussing it with the board on how to do that, and they have some ideas about how to do that. They have not yet requested the city's assistance on that. That's not, we don't know that for sure whether they will or not. But they're mainly seem to be taking the responsibility. They looked at another electric vehicle that is in production that would be lower cost than replacing a vehicle that is not in production. The trade-off there is the existing shuttle is 22 feet. The new one would be 30. And then the question would that shuttle be taken off the shelf, or would the body be changed in a way to make it look more like the current shuttle, which is more a emulation of the trolley car that used to run down State Street. So Jerry is almost, the director is almost finished with that conversation with MTD, and we expect to be having that in the next 2 months about what that looks like, and then we'll be talking about the contractual changes to, if there are any, for the future service as well.
Have they said anything about increasing costs and having the contract be more, provide more revenue to MTD just to provide the same level of service?
It's just too early to say. They haven't said that, but that is something that we would anticipate.
Okay. And the original capital for the buses, MTD covered those back in the day?
It was a mix. The city did
redevelopment.
The redevelopment agency did chip in on, I think it was the first 2 or 3 shuttles, but then as the demand was overwhelming, I think you remember the demand. We went to, I think, something like 200,000 to 1 million riders in a year. Needed more shuttles, and MTD covered that cost through grant funding.
Well, any other thoughts about the cost shifts, Councilmember Dominguez?
So, very general thoughts without having more specific numbers, but in terms of the movement to the general fund, I think anytime we're kind of making bookkeeping moves that make the use of funds more aligned with the sources and the other spending out of the fund, I think it probably makes sense, because otherwise you end up in a situation where 10 years from now we have a lot of things that we're not sure why they were there, we forget, and then we have to clean up a lot more, which is more difficult. So I'm always in favor of incremental changes, even if they're not going to be the primary source of fixing the problem, which is either increasing revenue or decreasing costs. So I don't think it's going to accomplish a lot, but I think it's important that we do it just as a matter of moving forward. The moves to Measure B, it seems it's more of a legal policy decision. Are these things that will be supported by Measure B? The city attorney can sort that out and make sure that it is. Again, those are intermediary measures that aren't going to solve the bulk of the problems, but if these are things that do meet legal muster, then seems like it's a good way to get this started until we do have the funds from another source. Again, that may or may not ever happen, so I'm going to take the more pragmatic approach, which is do the little things until we can get the big things done, and then make whatever shifts we would need to at that point. And regarding the shuttle, again, yeah, I think once we evaluate the level of service, look at the who's using it and where they're going, and make sure that the whatever comes in to replace these shuttles makes sense based on that demographic and those use models. I know overall MTD usage is dropping, so we want to make sure we're not increasing if it's going to be a service that's going to be decreasing in terms of how many people are using it. So I think that data we can collect would be really helpful in informing that decision.
Councilmember White?
Thank you. On the shuttle, is the shuttle going down in use at this point? It is.
Yes. Committee Member White, it has been going down steadily, and certain portions of the year are affected more than others. But I think it there has been some, the Downtown Parking Committee has expressed an interest in looking at some of those changes and what is the best way to serve the downtown and the need of the original idea, which was the people mover, the park
Right.
once mentality.
Right. And does MTD contribute any dollars toward that, or is this just completely funded by as a city contract?
They do. They do subsidize it. I think there's, we have never really done a study to say this is exactly, how much it is. MTD is charging us $90 a revenue hour, and they're saying that that's a really, really good deal. That the cost is more, and as we are real familiar with the transit, MTD subsidizes much of the transit, usually to the tune of 50% on a line. So there is some subsidy there. We haven't nailed down exactly what it is, but
I think that would be helpful to know. And I feel to make the call on the Measure B, there's shifts there. I think Mr. Hart's point's a good one about that this is a compact with the voters, as you said, and obviously with our hotel system, and I don't want to break that bond. I'd like to hear what what else are we going to do? I mean, is the preference that the streets don't get cleaned? Or do we cut back on the street sweeping, for example? Or do we invade the Measure B funds, which have not been? Measure B now covers half of some portion of street sweeping, doesn't it? Half?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember White, Measure B covers the residential portion of the street sweeping program, which is approximately 2/3.
Okay.
As I understand it, Measure B contributes to make up the difference between what our costs are and what we get from parking enforcement revenue. And so I think last year was...
Let's just ballpark a big fraction of some kind like that.
I think that last year the revenue from parking enforcement was something around 600. I might be way off, but I think that the Creek's contribution from Measure B was on the order of a little over 100,000 or 150,000.
In the recommended budget for FY17, it's a $100,000 contribution this year. The range has gone anywhere from 70,000 to 215,000.
Okay.
Over the years.
Okay. And then this would the proposal that's listed here is to add 150 to that 100,000. Just use the ballpark, but to augment the existing contribution by 150, or have it be 150.
It's to transfer the cost of the commercial street sweeping program, which is approximately 150,000, which streets funds
Which
pay for.
predated Measure B when it existed and
Predated
and the reason why it is a streets fund or a general fund expense is because it predated Measure B and it's a maintenance of effort.
Right, and
issue.
And Mr. Chair, the residential program was expanded with the Measure B funds and the contribution.
Okay, well that's a good point. So, I do not feel comfortable with those. I think that and then I do ask about the land development review fee. Obviously, I'd raise the question about the planning fee costs. Were these included in the subsidy when we were talking about what portion of costs are covered by planning fees? Were these positions included in that whole package?
They were.
Okay. All right. Well, as I mentioned before, that's an opportunity for long-term. I hope that we'll can keep on looking at, particularly in good times, increasing the proportion of cost recovery that developers pay for going forward. We've got a very small increment proposed this year. I think there's more opportunity there going forward, and obviously the needs are virtually everywhere for more funding. Thank you.
I think we have a time management question for the committee. We have the additional presentation about potential revenue options, and what we really only have about 10 or 15 minutes. I don't know if you have time to do justice to that, or if we should just save that for the next time.
Just for time management purposes, our thought was just real quickly, is there anything you wanted us to focus on for the next meeting? And we'd spend more time on the next meeting, look at the revenue options. And so this was just supposed to be a little teaser to see if there was anything in particular you wanted us to look at or not look at. So you could just flip through the slides and tell us.
Good.
Or I'll let Mr. Samario come up and...
John, make it. Should I? Okay.
Well, I guess they all kind of array on a continuum as well. There are big things, and there are relatively small things. I think if we're going to do big things, it's hard to justify it'll be hard to sell the pain of the small things if we're trying to do the good things, big things. I mean, for example, the on-street parking pricing is a big change in the reality of the city and would be very, I think it'd be very controversial. I don't know what other council members think about that. Councilmember White just talked about increasing fees for land development. I think assessment districts are an alternative to a general revenue approach, not supplementary. I don't see them that way. I think you sort of do one or the other. I am interested in knowing about borrowing against future Measure A revenue as a way to jumpstart funds in the short term, and what staff thinks about the very low interest rate environment that we're in today and borrowing costs being about as low historically as you could have versus the ability to manage a big contract like that and have that work be done, and how disruptive that would be to do it one fell swoop. I think the dining revenues is sort of along the same lines as Councilmember White was talking about, as a long-term revenue source, relatively small. And the stormwater management fees is like assessment districts. Those things, I think, are part of a different strategy versus a general revenue growth, new revenue growth strategy.
Mr. Chair, I just want to point out the assessment fee, the stormwater fee that we have in there would actually be a property-related fee. We're just beginning, so it would not be subject to vote. It would be a majority protest.
Oh, really? Okay.
But it would require significant legal review. We've just gotten extremely preliminary input from the attorney's office on whether or not we think we could do it.
Mr. Chair, if I can make a suggestion, this list, we could probably come back next on the 28th, which is our plan, June 28th, and talk about all of these with maybe putting some emphasis on some that are the larger ones, but at least maybe give some attention to each of these, because I think some of these, a lot of these have merit, and they may not be duplicative. For example, the assessment districts, we can structure them that they're maintenance districts so that they're ongoing, dealing with maintenance issues, versus sales tax measure would be more infrastructure, capital infrastructure improvements. So I'm not sure that they are, I think they could be complementary. But we can come back with discussion of all these and, paying more attention to the bigger dollar items and more emphasis on those if you like.
Well, I think just by time, we're going to have to do it that way. So other comments from council members?
Well, I agree with that last one. I think that we just should pick, these are mostly longer term proposals. And so I think for us not to continue right this minute, I think that would be a good idea. I think I have I'm afraid, Mr. Chair, over time that our reality is going to be supplementary rather than one versus the other. I think that the needs are so great that there's going to, and then of course the question will be what tolerance the city is going to have for what scale revenue proposal in a year and a half. that's obviously a big one. If there was just, you know, a 1 cent sales tax increase that was going to happen, then that would probably take care of all needs. I'm skeptical about that scale, and so I do think it's going to be these various smaller fundings are going to be necessary over time anyway. And I don't know how, you know, you obviously don't throw them all out there on the table all at once, but I regret to say that I just see unless something magical is going to come out of state and federal areas, that virtually all of these are going to be needed in some fashion or another going forward, including, you know, that bête noire, the paid parking on the streets as well. I just think it may be something that would happen further down the road, but I think most of them are going to be needed.
Any other comments? Is there anybody who in the public who'd like to speak to these items? Ms. Raisin?
Good afternoon, Bonnie Raisin. I followed the actions of the Finance Committee and the decisions pretty carefully. Today, you've lost me. I mean, I don't know how you are going to present the package of some of these proposals. I know it has a ways to go before you do. You know, I've gotten bits and pieces of information, and so I don't want to go off half-cocked thinking that I know it all. I don't. What strikes me, though, is if it's an either-or thing for the public, and how are they going to grasp, I mean, individual, well, for instance, the funk zone and 500,000. I mean, how are you going to say, okay, it's either this or a sales tax on the whole community? I mean, I am wondering, is it possible to have an overlay? This presentation today is for the highly educated. It's not, you know, for mom and pop out there. For instance, I got the bit of information from Mr. Coates about the Measure B and how that money, some of that money was supposed to go to the storm drains, right? I mean, that was what I think I heard. And so maybe people aren't worried about storm drains until we have a major flood, and then, you know, they'll worry about storm drains. But I think what I'm trying to say is there a way to say, okay, folks, this is what it's going to cost, development fees, 200,000 or whatever, and then all of these costs, sidewalks for the property owner, that's going to come as a huge shock. You know, for me, I would rather not see that happen and give up the street sweeping, you know, but maybe my neighbor doesn't feel that way. Maybe they're fine with bearing the cost of $900,000 to fix the sidewalk. And I mean, that one city, Santa Monica, does not do it, and some other major cities do. It looks like, short of an increase in the sales tax, the general public's going to be hit no matter what. And that's what concerns me. So how are you going to break it down so that each segment, the developer, the private property owner, the person who wants the streets swept, the person who is breaking their neck on the sidewalks, are they willing to pay for that? I mean, somehow, I hope that I am not just unreasonably demanding on this, but to justify these some way as opposed to an overall sales tax, I think has to happen. And I don't know how you're going to get there, but I appreciate Mr. Hart's comments about some of these rethinking, Measure B, for example. So, you know, anything you can do to simplify this for the general public, departments, or through the Finance Committee and then the City Council would be more than helpful. if you have the time and the willingness, it would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess for me, for staff, it would be helpful to me to have the total expense side of this before we start talking about the revenues, because it's to me it's a scale issue. You know, like what exactly is it when we added up all these things? What are the numbers that we're looking at? And let's look at that list that the council subcommittee worked on previously, the $400 million list, I think is what the number was, and see if that list captures the things that we've talked about here adequately, and over what time horizon, and whether or not the escalating cost of the deferred maintenance is captured by that number as well. That, I think, is something that I'm not sure was captured, because my instinct is that the public wants to know exactly the scale of the problem and what a revenue increase proposal would do to that relationship, and I think my sense of it is the public would prefer to know all the bad news and to know how much medicine is required to solve the problem than to be told that this isn't going to solve the problem, but we'll have to do more down the road. I think him understanding, that relationship is critical to being successful, and being direct and clear with the public. So that's the way I'd approach the next phase. Rather than spend a lot of time looking at all the different ways we could raise revenue, let's fine tune what the costs are over the next 20, 30 year horizon, and then see what revenue, what's the scale of the revenue increase that's necessary to solve that problem. But that's my personal view. Councilmember Dominguez?
So I want to say I definitely empathize with those comments. We have 9 programs up here that are all very complicated, each in and of itself in its own right. There's a lot of policy analysis, a lot of cost analysis. So I could see how even being a brand new council member up here, it's very intimidating having to figure out what are the actual implications, not only on what it does in terms of raising revenues, but what it will do to services. And then what are any unintended consequences that could happen when you put in parking? Is that going to decrease the number of people who show up to support the businesses? Is it going to increase traffic because people are trying to drive around looking for cheaper parking options? So each one of these has a whole lot of discussion involved, a whole lot of research. So it's definitely going to be a demanding thing. And maybe we can do a town hall. Maybe we can filter it down to some of the ones that make sense. But we have to keep in mind the whole backdrop is services in the state and the country are just more expensive than they've ever been. And we're still in a recession. A lot of other cities are doing a lot worse than we are. A lot of cities have gone bankrupt because of some of these issues. And we're not sure exactly where we're going to be economically in the next upcoming years. So we want to approach these things fairly cautiously.
Okay. Well, with that, we're adjourned. Thank you.